Greetings from my small cabin on the eastern shore of Virginia. My name is Mao Van Duren. I maintain this website to post documents, reports, and presentations on topics of interest that deserve a full discussion in the United States. Today, we enjoy the next installment of the presentations by Leonard Giannessi. He discusses Venezuela and the effects of the United States policy on that country. I'm sure you will enjoy the lectures as much as I do. Thank you.
This talk is directed to the Biden administration, and in the talk I develop the theme that the Biden administration should cancel sanctions that were imposed on Venezuela due to its 2018 presidential election. Basically, in 2018, Venezuela had a presidential election. The Trump administration didn't like the election, the way it was carried out, and the Trump administration imposed sanctions as a result. And my recommendation is that those sanctions be lifted. A little history of Venezuela and its presidential election history. Beginning in 1830, Venezuela was ruled by dictators and the military. But in 1958, regular presidential elections were begun in the country, and the turnout, the voter turnout for those elections were in the 80 to 90% of voters came out and voted for president, starting in 1958 under normal circumstances. Nicolas Maduro, who is a big part of this talk, was elected president in 2013 with 51% of the vote. There was 80% turnout for his election, and in November 2017, Maduro indicated that he would seek re-election in 2018. So the 2018 presidential election was going to elect a president that would serve from 2019 to 2024. And under normal practice, the presidential election would be held in December. Just as in the U.S., we hold our presidential election in November and the president sworn in January. In Venezuela, normally the presidential election would be in December and the president would be sworn in January. Now, there was a poll done of potential opposition voters in early 2018 looking at their preferences to run for president. And there were 7 candidates, and we're going to meet them all in a few minutes, but just left to right to introduce them to you. Enrique Capriles on the far left was polling at 17%. Henry Ramos Alop was polling at 8%. Henry Falcon at 15%. Maria Machado at 8%. Julio Borges at 5%. And then the 2 top leading candidates, potentially Leopoldo Lopez at 25%. and Lorenzo Mendoza at 17%. So there were 7 potential major candidates to oppose Maduro. Well, 2 of those potential candidates chose not to run. Lorenzo Mendoza is a billionaire CEO. He had certainly been mentioned many times as a potential outsider to assume the presidency, but he chose not to run. Maria Machado, who is a former National Assembly member and had tried to run for president in the past, she also chose not to run. It was their own decision. Now, 2 potential opposition candidates were serving criminal and administrative sentences, and they couldn't run because they basically were serving sentences. Enrique Capriles had run for the presidency in 2012 and 2013. He came close in 2013 with 49% of the vote, but he was ineligible in 2018, as was Leopoldo Lopez, who was a former mayor of a municipality in Venezuela. Lopez's problem was that in 2015, he was convicted of inciting riots in which 43 people were killed, and he was sentenced after a year-long trial to 14 years in jail. And in 2018, Lopez had been moved to jail to house arrest. And you can see him in this photograph waving to the crowd of supporters who gathered outside his house. But basically, in 2018, Lopez was serving a sentence for inciting riots. Enrique Capriles in 2017 the Comptroller General of Venezuela banned Capriles from holding office for 15 years. And the problem that Capriles had was that when he was governor, he was charged with misusing public funds, and he was deemed unfit to hold public office because when he was governor, he redirected monies, contracts to his own companies, and he also took funds that had been earmarked for workers' salaries, and he moved them into other projects. And so basically the Comptroller General ruled that Capriles had misused public funds, he was unfit to hold public office, and he was banned for 15 years. So he couldn't run for president in 2018. Now, I'll mention registration requirements for political parties. Not just anybody can get on the ballot to run in a presidential election. There are requirements. And one of the requirements was that a party, in order to have a candidate in the presidential election, had to have participation in the previous national election. And 3 of the political parties in Venezuela had chosen not to run candidates in the last 2017 national municipal elections. They chose not to run in 2017, and those were the Popular Will, First Justice, and Democratic Action parties. And so their requirement is, if you didn't run in the previous national election, the party had to re-register. And the re-registration bar wasn't that high. All the party had to do was to collect signatures from 0.5% of voters in at least 12 states that they got to choose. So it's not a very high bar, but you can't just get on the ballot in Venezuela without having been in the previous election unless you re-register. So the Democratic Action Party, Henry Ramos Allop's party, they had not participated in the 2017 election, and Allop wanted to run for the presidency, and so his party went out and got 0.5% of the voters in 12 provinces, and they were able to qualify to be on the ballot, and Ramos Allop announced that he was going to be a candidate for president. Now, the First Justice Party decided not to re-register. It was their choice not to re-register, and as a result, Julio Borges, who was the National Assembly president, could not be a candidate. And, he was only polling at 5%, and so the general assumption is that the party felt that he could not win the election, and so why re-register and go down to defeat. The Popular Will Party also chose not to re-register, and as a result, this young politician, Juan Guaido, could not be a candidate in 2018. He was largely unknown in 2018, and so again, the party was essentially in the position of not having a candidate that was polling very highly, and there was no reason to re-register. So again, it was their choice not to re-register. Now, 2 new parties registered to run. These parties had never run in a national election before, so they had to register. You had Javier Bertucci, who was an evangelical minister. He'd never run before. His party, the Hope for Change Party, registered. He was able to run. And there was also a leftist in the Popular Political Unity Party. He'd never run before. They went out and got 0.5% of the voters, and he got on the ballot as well. Now, Henry Falcone, who was one of those 7 candidates, was leader of the Progressive Advance Party. Now, his party had run in the 2017 national election, so he didn't have to re-register. The party did not have to re-register. They could run a candidate for president because they'd been in the 2017 election. So Henry Falcone, who is a former governor, announced that he was going to be a candidate for president. So this is a summary of what happened to those 7 potential candidates. Lorenzo Mendoza and Maria Machado both chose not to run. It was their choice. Julio Borges and Juan Guaido, their parties chose not to re-register, and so they couldn't run. Leopoldo Lopez was under house arrest. He couldn't run. Enrique Capriles had been disqualified for running because of misuse of public funds. So there were 4 candidates that had announced their intention to run for president. Henry Falcone, Henry Ramos Allop, and the 2 new candidates with new parties who went out and got their parties registered so their candidates could run. Now, in September of 2017, Maduro made an outreach effort to the opposition. There's an opposition coalition of parties in Venezuela. They generally nominate a single candidate, and Maduro met with that opposition coalition and said, we need to have a dialogue, we need to agree on the election process. And so beginning in 2017, dialogue meetings were held in the Dominican Republic, facilitated by the Dominican President Medina and former Spanish Prime Minister Zapatero. You can see, the dialogue set up with the Maduro people on one side of the table and the opposition coalition on the other side, and Zapatero, Medina in there coordinating the dialogue. What are the issues? Can you agree? So one of the issues that was raised by the opposition was that they wanted detainees who were arrested during riots in 2014 and 2017 to be released. You see the picture there on the right, that the riots were in 2017. You see rioters burning the Supreme Court building in Venezuela. They were arrested. They were awaiting trial. And so basically the opposition said, we want all of those opposition rioters released. So Maduro released 44. He released 44 prisoners who were awaiting trial for participating in the riots, but Leopoldo Lopez was not released. He was not released from house arrest or given any sort of pardon. Another request made by the opposition was to have UN observers observe the election. The United Nations has a team that will go into a country, if requested, and observe the election and make a determination as to whether or not the election was free or fair. So Maduro initially opposed this request. He thought it was a potential violation of national sovereignty to have a supranational agency like the UN come in and bless the election or condemn it. But he came around. Maduro came around and said that he would have their electoral council request a UN mission. Now, the other opposition request, major request, was to have an early election. And you can see the picture there on the right. There were demonstrations in Venezuela in 2017 where the opposition said, we want to have an election as early as possible. And basically the thinking was that the earlier the election, the greater their chance of beating Maduro. He was unpopular at the time. And so the earlier they could capitalize on his unpopularity, the better chance it would have. And an important point is that the United States backed this claim, backed the request or the demand that there be an early election. There's a quote from the U.S. State Department. We call on the government of Venezuela to hold elections as soon as possible. That was a consistent message from the United States in 2017. Let's hold an early election. So on January 23rd, 2018, the Electoral Council said, we're going to have an election. It won't be in December. We're going to have it before the end of April 2018. Normally the election would be in December. The opposition wanted to have it early, and so the National Electoral Council said, okay, we'll have it by the end of April. And government negotiators there in the Dominican Republic said publicly that the opposition had agreed to this date. And in fact, the opposition coalition went out publicly and said on January 24th that the opposition coalition, the Democracy Unity Roundtable, they would support a unified presidential candidate. So everything looked set for an early election. There was just one dissenter. And that dissenter was Mike Pence, the Vice President of the United States. The United States changed its position. The United States had been calling for an early election. But Pence on January 24th said, these are snap elections. They're going to be undemocratic, unconstitutional, and globally opposed. State Department officials stated that the U.S. would not recognize the election results. So after publicly calling for an early election throughout 2017, the United States changed its position once the election had been called early, and Mike Pence basically began telegraphing this message that these elections will be illegitimate, the result of which will not be recognized. So the United States was stating its position months before the election and claiming that the election would be illegitimate. just because the Electoral Council had done what the United States wanted, calling an early election. When February of 2018, Maduro went public with signing the agreement that had been negotiated with the opposition. Maduro signed the agreement saying this is what we had agreed with the opposition on, the date of the election, the electoral guarantees. And Maduro, when he signed the agreement, said the opposition had also agreed to sign the agreement. But the opposition did not sign the agreement. The spokesperson was Julio Borges, who was one of those potential candidates for president. The opposition did not sign the agreement. They'd been working with the government for months on the potential agreement. The opposition withdrew from the talks, and basically one of the objections was the opposition said, we asked you to free Leopoldo Lopez from his house arrest, and you didn't do it, and so we're leaving. And Borges also accused the government of arbitrarily imposing its own date for the election. Now, Zapatero, who was the Spanish dialogue coordinator running the dialogue, was sort of outraged by what happened. He said that there had been a basic agreement between the opposition and Maduro about the election, the date of the election, how to run the election. There had been agreement. The parties had agreed to recognize the results of the election no matter who won, which is one of the basic tenets of democracy. The parties had agreed to do that. And Zapatero said he found it shocking that the opposition did not sign the document. Maduro signed the document. This is what had been agreed to in the Dominican Republic. The opposition did not sign it. Now, the communications minister for Venezuela came out with a statement to the press, and basically the statement from the Venezuelan communication minister was that the reason that the opposition didn't sign it was because the United States, particularly Secretary of State Tillerson, had called the opposition spokesman, Borges, and said, don't sign the deal. Don't sign off on the deal. We have another idea in mind, and this election isn't something we're going to support. On February 21st, the opposition coalition basically announced that they were going to boycott the election. The coordinator for the coalition at that point said that there were conditions under which they would participate in the election. And you can see those, he said that the conditions were that there be an election in the second half of the year. After they'd been calling for the election in the first half of the year, they also shifted when the government agreed and said, no, we want it in the second half of the year. They wanted the creation of a balanced national electoral council. And I'll talk about that in a moment. But then finally, you can see they want the reversal of exclusions of parties and leaders. Again, the parties were excluded. They excluded themselves. The two parties chose not to register or re-register to run a candidate for president. And the leaders were excluded because one of them was under house arrest and the other one had been convicted of misusing public funds. And so basically what the opposition coalition is saying, well, you should free Leopoldo Lopez. Yes, he incited riots. He's under arrest, but he should be able to run for president. And basically they're complaining that the government didn't agree to do that. Now, a word about the National Electoral Council. It's an independent branch of government. It has its own budget set up by the National Assembly. The Electoral Council is not part of the executive branch. All national elections are run by the Electoral Council. There's one set of rules for the entire country. Here in the United States, we have different rules for all these states. Mississippi has one set of rules. Massachusetts has another set of rules. In Venezuela, they have one set of electoral rules for the entire country. There's a 5-member board of directors that governs the Electoral Council, and those board members are appointed by the National Assembly. So this is the makeup of the board of directors of the Electoral Council in 2018. All of the members, all 5 of these members, had been approved by the National Assembly or the Supreme Court that had a majority of their members to be Maduro supporters. 4 members to the left here in this photograph, those 4 members on the left generally supported the government's positions and requests. One member on the far right generally supported the opposition. So there was at least one serious opposition member supporter on the Electoral Council. And who was this? Well, it was Luis Emilio Rondon. He was a member of the Electoral Council, and here's what the previous member of the Electoral Council said about Rondon. He's the person who knows more about elections than anybody else in the country. If there's someone who won't miss a beat, it's him. And without a doubt, there is a set of eyes and a voice that represents the opposition. So the opposition had a supporter on the Electoral Council, and he was very, very knowledgeable, and he was very willing to speak out and be an effective dissenting voice if necessary. And that's what he did. As a member of the Electoral Council, he routinely criticized publicly the decisions of the Electoral Council. Members of the opposition told him to resign. Please resign, because you're just adding legitimacy to the Electoral Council's decisions, and it prevents us from really claiming that there is no representation. If you were to resign, then there wouldn't be any representation for the opposition. But he would not resign. He continued to carry out his term, and he continued to criticize the rulings of the Electoral Council when he thought it was appropriate. Now, Maduro had a bright idea, and his idea was to have a mega election. He looked down and he saw that the opposition was going to boycott the presidential election. They weren't going to run. So he figured that he's going to win the presidential election, and he came up with the idea of having the National Assembly election at the same time. You know, if the opposition is going to boycott the presidential election, they'd be boycotting the election for the members of the National Assembly, and then all Maduro's supporters would win that race as well. And so Maduro asked the Electoral Council in Venezuela to combine, to schedule the presidential race and the National Assembly race simultaneously on the same date, and he figured he'd win everything. Now, the United States was very upset by this. The state, here you see a spokesperson for the State Department saying, we reject what Maduro is requesting here. We reject Maduro's request to have the National Assembly election and the presidential election on the same day. You know, that would not be constitutional. And so again, the State Department and its spokespeople are saying, we reiterate our claim and our call that there should be an establishment of a legitimate and independent National Electoral Council. That's our opinion was the Electoral Council was not balanced. And so here we have the spokesperson for the United States saying, you know, they should be independent. Well, they were independent. The National Electoral Council refused Maduro's request to combine the election. So, you know, the opposition supporter voted to reject Maduro, but at least two of those other members who generally supported Maduro, they voted against Maduro as well. And so they were not a rubber stamp council. They rejected this request, and the election for president was going to go on without combining it with the assembly elections. Now, why did the opposition coalitions boycott the election? And Greg Wilpert essentially was very puzzled by this. It's very puzzling why they chose to boycott the election. The economy's in hyperinflation. Real wages have dropped dramatically. Shortages continue to cause problems. Maduro was very unpopular. This is the best opportunity the opposition has ever had in Venezuela to elect a president. Maduro was very unpopular, and so why did the opposition just say, we're not going to support anybody? So Wilpert answered his own question as to why the opposition coalition boycotted the election by basically saying that the only plausible explanation was that the opposition didn't want to win just the presidency, but wanted to sweep everybody out from the government. And the basic way to do that was to provoke a political and economic crisis. A presidential election where Maduro gets all the votes might appeal to the international community to intervene in Venezuela, perhaps provoking a coup in the country. And in fact, that's what Rex Tillerson was advocating during a Latin American tour in early February 2018. Tillerson said plainly that there would be a change in Venezuela, and it wouldn't come about through an election. Tillerson advocated that the military take action to essentially have a coup, take over the government, and have a radical change in the country. Now, Todd Robinson was our leading official from the United States in Venezuela. We did not have an embassy ambassador. So Todd Robinson was our chief diplomat in the country. And there are a couple of different sources that verify what Robinson was doing. And what he did was he went to Ramos Alep. He visited Ramos Alep and he visited Henry Falcone to try to convince them not to run in the election. And basically, these sources said that Robinson threatened both Ramos Alep and Falcone with sanctions, that President Trump would put sanctions on them if they ran for president. So Ramos Alep dropped out. He never did register to be a presidential candidate. He said he would after his party re-registered. He was one of the 7 major potential candidates. He said he would run. But after being visited by Robinson and essentially threatened by the United States, he chose not to. And again, the Minister of Communications asked the obvious question, what did they do? How did they persuade him? Did they extort his non-participation? Did they blackmail him somehow? The story hasn't been told yet, but he did pull out. So that left it all up to one guy, and that was Henry Falcone, one of the 7 potential candidates, a former governor. And again, this story was broken in the U.S. News and World Report. It wasn't in the New York Times. It wasn't in the Washington Post. It was in U.S. News and World Report, where it was reported that Falcone was told by U.S. officials, including Robinson, that the Trump administration would place sanctions against him and on his family if he entered the presidential race. So it all came down to what Falcone would do, and Falcone registered to run for the presidency. He felt he could win, and he went down, and you can see him meeting with the board of directors of the National Electoral Council. He came in and said, my party's registered, I'm registering, I want to be a candidate for president. Now, what did the opposition do? They expelled him immediately. They threw him out of the coalition. They said the coalition would not support his candidacy. And the opposition coalition actually encouraged voters to not vote for Falcone. So here you have a potential credible candidate, and he registers to run, and he's told nobody's going to vote for him. Now, Falcone there was a public opinion poll in March, and the public opinion poll showed that he was 10 percentage points ahead of Maduro. And the Washington Post even went out and put a statement out saying Falcone has a fighting chance if he can get people to vote. And so he was 10 percentage points ahead in the polls. He's got a fighting chance. But the opposition to Maduro, the opposition coalition, is telling people not to vote for Falcone. And why was that? Well, Telesur again provided us some analysis here, and that is, they stated the obvious. Falcone was a legitimate and important opposition figure running for president. And so as a result of him just running, the elections gain legitimacy. It goes in the international community. It goes against Washington's attempts to discredit that election. And essentially by what the United States wanted to do was to discredit the election, discredit the government, and lay the groundwork for a military coup. But just by having Falcone participate in the election, it undermined the U.S. position. Now, the head of the National Electoral Council in February came out and said, according to Maduro and according to the agreement that they had in the Dominican Republic, she was requesting a observer mission from the United Nations to come to Venezuela and observe the election. That's what the opposition wanted. Maduro agreed to it, and so she says, I'm going to request the mission from the UN. And in fact, Henry Falcone, second from the left, and representatives of Maduro came to New York. They traveled to New York and they said, we want a UN mission. We're running for president, Falcone in the opposition, Maduro as president, we want a UN mission. And then a strange thing happened back in Caracas. the opposition, protesters from the opposition showed up outside the UN office in Caracas, and they demonstrated against having a UN mission in Venezuela. And you can see a direct quote. The opposition alleged that an observer mission from the United Nations would give a veneer of legality. That's all legality was, in their opinion, a veneer. And they then asked that the UN not send a mission. And the opposition sent a letter to the UN saying, this is after they had requested a UN mission in their dialogue talks. The United States opposed sending a mission, and basically the UN declined to send a mission without giving a reason. The Electoral Council asked the EU to send a mission. Please, the EU has electoral observers that they send around the world when requested, and Venezuela said, we want an EU mission to come to Venezuela and observe our election. And the EU declined the request without giving a reason. Now, one of the things that they do to make sure that the electoral process is free and fair in Venezuela is that they have 18 public televised audits. They're on television, and the candidates, in this case, Falcon's representatives, Maduro's representatives, signed the results of the audits. Are the ballot machines operating appropriately? Are the counting mechanisms that they had in place operating the way they're supposed to? They have 18 of those audits, and then once they verify that everything is working right, the machines are locked up. Nobody touches them until the election occurs. And you can see that both Maduro and Falcon signed those agreements right in front of the Electoral Council. And they agreed on a date of May 20th. Now, Falcon was a very energetic campaigner. He had access to Venezuelan state TV. He had a 35-minute speech on Venezuelan TV where he blasted Maduro as being the hunger candidate. He did interviews on the private TV network, saying that Maduro's government was an unscrupulous monster. So Falcon was out there working hard, campaigning hard, very vigorous, had access to the press, and had coverage and audiences. So did Maduro. Maduro campaigned throughout the campaign in Venezuela, and his message was the problems that they were having in Venezuela were caused by an economic war waged by the United States. And so you had this difference of opinion. Who caused the economic problems? Falcon said it was Maduro. Maduro blamed the United States. I mean, it was for the people to decide whether or not they wanted Maduro to continue. But Mike Pence intervened again a couple weeks before the election, May 7th. He comes out with the same statement saying it's a so-called election. It's illegitimate. It's going to be a sham, a fraud. And the United States will bring all the pressure down on Venezuela to restore democracy. Basically, this has been the message from the United States starting in January 2018, continuing right up to the election. The election's going to be a fraud. The election's going to be illegitimate. And they just kept pounding that message. On voting day, voters turned out in very large numbers in municipalities that generally supported the government. You see a long line of voters wanting to vote. They voted in past elections, and they support their democracy and their right to vote. Now, in polling stations like this one, that's in an opposition municipality, nobody showed up. There were very few voters. The machines are set up, all the audited safeguards are in place, but the opposition coalition urged them not to vote. There were 150 international observers that were given access to all phases of the election process. And you can see here they're election observers with their accreditation cards around their neck, and they're taking photographs, they're asking questions. What are you doing? How does this procedure work? How do you know it's accurate? And these were observers from all over the world, from Spain, the UK, Ireland. There were observers from the United States, not an official observation team, but there were observers from all these different countries, 150 of them. Well, what were the results of the 2018 presidential election? Well, Maduro received 68% of the vote. There was only a 46% voter turnout. That's very low by Venezuelan standards. It's about average for the United States. Only 46% of the registered voters came out to vote. You can see that Henry Falcone got 1.8 million votes. He lost by 4 million votes. The two new party candidates, the leftist and the minister, got about 1 million votes. So those were the official results announced by the Electoral Council. Now the 150 international observers immediately wrote a report that they released on May 21st, and they said, look, we consider that the technical and professional trustworthiness and independence of the Electoral Council are uncontestable. In other words, those 150 observers looked over the process and they came out with the conclusion that there was no fraud here, it was a free and fair election. And there were different sets of electoral observers that provided their own reports. The Council of Electoral Experts of Latin America. The will of the citizens, freely expressed in ballot boxes, was respected. The results communicated by the Electoral Council reflect the will of the voters who chose to participate in the process. There was a report from several Caribbean countries. They wrote a separate report. And the results of the elections reflect the will of the majority of voters in Venezuela. An African report of observers from several African countries were there. They wrote a separate report. This was a free, fair, and transparent expression of the human right to vote. The results announced on the night of May 20th are trustworthy. Now, the African mission included Anthony Witherspoon, who was mayor of Magnolia, Mississippi. Like I said, the United States didn't have an official mission down there, but Witherspoon hooked up with the African mission. And you can see his quote, the Venezuelan voting system is more trustworthy and reliable than the voting system in the United States. Venezuela is a true democracy. So we're getting this drumbeat from 150 international observers saying that the election was free and fair. There was just one dissenter, and that was Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, who the day after the election said the United States condemns the fraudulent election that took place in Venezuela. The regime stacked the courts, stacked the Electoral Council, biased members. It banned major opposition parties and leaders from participating. And worst of all, the regime selectively parceled out food to manipulate the voters. So again, nobody else had said this. There were 150 observers on the ground in Venezuela, and nobody brought up these issues. They didn't observe what Pompeo is asserting. And to this day, there's never been a report out of the State Department that documents any of these assertions. The State Department did not release any report documenting Pompeo's assertion, and it still hasn't been issued. It's just assertions that Secretary of State Pompeo made. And Mike Pence weighed in also right after the election. You know, he just said what he had been saying for 6 months. Venezuela's election was a sham, neither free nor fair. It's like a blow against democracy. They were democratic right up into this election, and somehow, according to the United States, that democracy didn't work. And again, Pence didn't cite any evidence. He didn't come to the American public and say, here's the evidence we have about why we think it was not free or fair. So that's when President Trump issued his executive order, essentially to punish Venezuela for holding this election. And what President Trump did was, he said, we're prohibiting transactions related to purchasing Venezuelan debt. In other words, anybody in the world who purchased Venezuelan debt or made any arrangement with Venezuela on loans or buying bonds were violating U.S. sanctions and could be fined by the United States. Not just U.S. citizens and U.S. institutions, but anywhere in the world, any entity, any bank who negotiated with Venezuela about its debt was violating a U.S. sanction. And this was a terrible blow to Venezuela because, as you can see in this article in the International Economy, Venezuela needed debt restructuring. Their foreign exchange reserves are going down to low levels. Venezuela desperately needed new financing in order to finance imports, which it so heavily depends on, including food and medicine. Venezuela needed to restructure its debt, needed to raise money in international markets, issue bonds, have different resources as collateral, renegotiate the terms of the debt so they could get much needed foreign currency to import food and medicine. Now, Todd Robinson, right after Maduro got elected, one of the first things he did was to expel Todd Robinson from Venezuela. You know, Todd Robinson had gone around and tried to persuade people not to run in the presidential election, and Maduro expelled him for being a conspirator against his government, and that was covered in the New York Times. Shortly thereafter, on May 22nd, the EU weighed in. And the EU, you see here is the High Representative of the EU for Foreign Affairs, said the EU would not recognize the results. And again, here's major obstacles of participation of opposition political parties and their leaders, unbalanced National Electoral Council, biased electoral conditions. This are all the things that the EU asserted, just asserted, and vote buying, stood in the way of a fair and equitable election. So the EU really kind of repeated what Mike Pence and Secretary Pompeo have been saying. Now, the EU got really criticized for its statement by Francisco Dominguez and 3 other election observers who came from the UK. And so Dominguez wrote a reply to the EU saying, your claims in your press release about the Venezuelan presidential race are fabrications of the most disgraceful kind, based on hearsay, not on evidence, not worthy of the EU. He pointed out that the EU was asked to send an electoral observer mission, and they chose not to. So none of the criticism in the EU press release is based on any kind of direct observations. There was no evidence presented by the EU. They just said, we're not going to recognize the elections, just like the United States. And basically, these observers from the EU said, you're way out of line here, because you didn't have anybody on the ground, and by the way, 150 international observers said it was free and fair. Better late than never, the Canadian delegation weighed in June. They had a delegation, including members from a teachers' federation, postal workers union, the United Church. We witnessed a transparent, secure, democratic, and orderly electoral and voting process. Now, Falcone claimed fraud. Falcone lost by 4 million votes, and he petitioned the Supreme Court, said, we want you to nullify the election because of voter coercion and vote buying, exactly what Pompeo was saying. But the court ruled against the annulment by saying, look, you got to show us 4 million votes. How can you show us which voters, communities, voting booths were subject to these alleged felonies? Again, it's like in the United States we've had allegations made by losing presidential candidates that, they lost by 8 million votes and they claimed fraud, and the Supreme Court said, well, show us the 8 million votes that you claim were stolen from you. In June, Maduro went further by releasing 79 more prisoners that were being held related to those riots in 2014 and 2017. You see a busload of detainees here that are being released. Again, Leopoldo Lopez was not released. Business as normal in Venezuela. President Maduro picked Delcy Rodriguez to be his vice president, and she had previously served as foreign minister, president of the Constituent Assembly. Everything is pretty normal. But then in August there was an assassination attempt against Maduro. Maduro was speaking at a military parade in Caracas, that's his wife standing next to him, and a drone flew very close to the stage and exploded. And the idea was that the drone and the explosion was going to kill Maduro. Well, it didn't happen that way. He was not injured. But 27 arrest warrants were issued by the chief prosecutor, and one of those, several of the people who were arrested, implicated Julio Borges as one of the conspirators. He was one of those potential presidential candidates, and the Supreme Court issued an arrest. These opposition members were playing pretty seriously in trying to get rid of Maduro. Maduro was sworn in January 10, 2019. He was sworn in by the president of the Venezuelan Supreme Court. His inauguration was attended by 90 international organizations, just perfectly normal international organizations, countries, being there and applauding him on the election. The United States, of course, was not there. So my conclusion is that the election sanctions, those sanctions preventing Venezuela from renegotiating its debt, should be canceled because the election was democratic. Henry Falcone was a credible opposition candidate. The U.S. has not cited any evidence that the election was fraudulent. Nothing has been cited in terms of evidence. 150 international observers said that the election was free and fair. Political parties were not banned. They chose not to re-register. That was their choice. Major candidates were not banned. They committed crimes, and they were serving sentences. As I tried to demonstrate, the National Electoral Council was independent. The government agreed to opposition requests to move the election date, to release rioters, to request UN observers. The government gave in on important points, but the opposition shifted its demands when the government agreed to them. There wasn't anything the government could do to prevent the opposition from shifting its demands, so it would never be acceptable. And finally, I just want to make the point that the United States undermined democracy in the election, and so it's pretty hypocritical of the United States to say it wasn't democratic when the United States actually undermined democracy. What did the United States do? The Secretary of State of the United States openly called for a coup instead of an election. The U.S. urged the opposition to boycott the election. The U.S. bullied potential candidates to not run. The U.S. began a narrative calling the election a sham. This would be a version of the big lie. The U.S. began that narrative 6 months before it occurred. The U.S. opposed independent UN observers of the election, and the U.S. shifted its demands when the government agreed to them.